have this awful and quite annoying creaking sound coming from my clock spring on my 2003 Tacoma. I'm not having any issues with my airbag lights or cruise control or anything like that. However, it's just really starting to bug me too much while I'm driving, so I'm going to show y'all how to replace that. So here's the part number for the OEM clock spring straight from Toyota, and it's the most expensive piece of plastic I've ever bought at about $300, but it's a pretty ingenious little piece of engineering as it allows you to have important electronics, namely your airbag, connected to your steering wheel, which of course is constantly spinning, and typically spinny things and wires don't work well together, so this allows you to have some flexibility there and keep some of those critical electrical connectors from breaking off when you're turning your wheel. Of course, I've got my trusty factory service manual here to see if there's anything we need to make note of, and there's actually only 2 torque specs for this particular job, but they are important ones as they secure the steering wheel and airbag to the steering column. We've also got a handful of helpful instructions from the manual that go over how to safely remove and store the airbag, as well as actually pull the steering wheel off the column. First things first, we have to remove the upper and lower steering column covers, and there are 3 Phillips head screws holding them in place, one on either side of the wheel, which can be accessed by rotating the wheel, and then one underneath as well. We also want to make sure that we perfectly center our steering wheel before we move on to the next step. With the keys out of the ignition, we now need to disconnect the negative battery terminal, as you never want to be fiddling with your airbag with any possibility of it deploying. Not only is that potentially dangerous, but if you leave your power connected, you also risk throwing check engine codes. Next, we have to remove 2 T30 torque screws from either side of the steering wheel, which are the only fasteners holding the airbag onto the wheel itself. And for my Harbor Freight peeps, this is a perfect chance to pull out your meme tool. With the torque screws removed, you can simply pull the airbag away from the wheel, but be careful as there will be 2 wires connected, a yellow cable that connects the clock spring to the airbag, as well as a smaller spade connector for the ground cable. Now for storage of the airbag, I would find a soft surface, and Toyota says we need to have the outer surface facing upward. There's one more clip we have to remove for the cruise control cables, and then we need to make match marks. Make sure you draw a line on the wheel, nut, and steering column on both the top and the bottom to ensure that when you reinstall everything, you know that it's perfectly aligned. I'm using my impact driver to remove the center nut, but you could certainly use a normal ratchet. Now we have to use a puller tool to remove the steering wheel, and there are 2 M8 by 1.25mm pitch threaded holes on the wheel, so I used 2 100mm bolts paired with the pulling tool to get it loose. The reason you need to use a puller tool is there's a dab of blue Loctite on the spline shaft of the steering column, so if your wheel has never been removed before, you'd be really hard pressed to get it off without that tool. We've now got direct access to the clock spring, and the only things holding this on are 2 electrical connectors underneath and 4 small Phillips head screws. I wanted to try to disassemble the old clock spring to see if I could tell why it was making that sound, but to be honest, it's a bit fragile and I didn't want to break it, so I couldn't see anything immediately apparent, but it gives you a chance to see what the ribbon cable looks like inside. For installing the new clock spring, there are a few more considerations we need to make to ensure that it's perfectly centered. So the device has a total of 5 turns that it can make from each of its limit points, meaning that 2.5 turns from either the leftmost or the rightmost limits will ensure that the clock spring is centered. So to do that, you first turn it one direction until you reach the limit, which you will feel with some resistance, and then you rotate it back the opposite direction 2.5 turns. To finish, you also have to make sure that you align the small arrows on the edge of the device before reinstalling the steering wheel. I'm placing a small dab of blue Loctite on the column splines again before sliding on the wheel and lining up my match marks as I do so. Because the column has these splines, it's pretty obvious when you're on the correct one so long as you've made those marks initially. The torque spec for the center nut is 35 foot-pounds, and the match marks on your nut should ideally realign with the other ones you've made. Triple check to make sure that you've reconnected all your plugs to both the clock spring and the airbag, and then reinstall the 2 torque screws on either side. The torque spec here is 78 inch-pounds, however I just snugged them up nice and tight. I reconnected my battery terminal to test all of my steering wheel controls and give it a final spin, and we are now smooth and quiet.